welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of an absolutely stunning book. This is bound to be one of my favorite reads of 2025. It is, I finished reading it yesterday and I'm still a little bit speechless, which is like, a difficult thing for when you're about to do an interview, but let's give it a shot. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Thank you so much, Jen. I am Kionna Walker LeMalle, the author of Behind the Waterline.
It's, as I said, a beautiful read. It made me feel so many things. It runs the gamut from deeply sad to deeply life-affirming, and those things are intertwined, of course. So we'll get into that. But before we do, could you tell us a little bit about your career, your journey as a writer, and what led you to this project?
Sure. Yes, I feel like my journey as a writer is a little convoluted in the sense that I've always been a writer by hobby ever since childhood. But I kind of thought that I needed to wait to pursue writing after getting settled in my career. I never saw writing as a career. So I'm a teacher by training. Started out as a special education teacher and then became a language arts teacher. And I would always write for my students. When I taught special education, I would write all of my students' content at multiple reading levels. I'd write stories for them, to make sure that they had things that they, could actually read and were interested in. And I would create stories with them as characters and things like that as just part of my teaching journey. And I would try to write in the fringes, because it's always been a passion of mine. It's always been an interest. When I started teaching junior high, I started the literary journal, at my school because I wanted to write. I wanted to teach kids to write. And I've always been into teaching kids to write in ways that go beyond test writing, which is not really real writing. And so doing things like the literary journal would allow me that opportunity. Um, but I finally kind of switched from being a teacher who writes in the fringes to being a writer who teaches on the side. So I actually write full time as an executive writer for the University of Houston downtown. And I teach creative writing in the MFA program at Houston Christian University. And of course, I'm working on, my own writing projects as well. So I have completely flipped the script in this part of my life. I still love teaching. I always have to get my teaching fix on. So I've done work with Houston's writers in the schools. I continue to adjunct for HCU. I'm teaching for the Louisiana Book Festival. I love to teach writing. And I run a group called Writer Teacher Friend. It's a small Facebook, community that just allows me to invest in others that are aspiring writers. But I do have an MFA in creative writing. So my final degree, my terminal degree, is an MFA in creative writing. And that was really what helped me to completely make the shift that I had been wanting to make for quite some time. But the idea of writing professionally didn't feel within reach for me. But yeah, now it's actually, I'm writing during the day, it's rhetoric all day, right? But what I have found is that there's writing is very fractal and there's overlap. There's lots of overlap. So I've done sessions with teachers on how the tools of rhetoric actually apply to fiction, right? Especially Kairos. So we don't think about that. We tend to think about them as being really separate. But since I'm writing all the time, I realize that, there's a lot of crossover in what you have to do when you're writing nonfiction, the nonfiction I write is often it's persuasive or it's a combo of like persuasive and narrative, you know. When you're writing fiction, you have to be persuasive as well. You've got to convince the reader to suspend disbelief and go with you. And that requires tapping into some reasoning skills, you know, filling in wherever your reader's going to poke holes because this can't happen. You know, you've got to figure out how to appeal to their sense of reasoning, even though you're creating something, right? And of course, emotion, and of course, giving your characters credibility. So all of those tools of rhetoric, right? And then timing, right? Like timing matters when I'm writing for it matters what we say when we say it. It matters when we release certain bits of news. Everything can't come out at the exact same time. You have to really feel the climate and plan it out, you know, ahead of time. Um, that happens, you know, with fiction as well, right? You don't reveal everything at one time, and a story is not necessarily chronological either. It depends on how time works in that particular story and the way that story needs to be told.
That's so fascinating. And it so perfectly anticipated my second question, which was about how the various forms of writing that you do inform each other, which you've answered very eloquently. Because I'm always really interested. I think that like what makes people unique as artists or as people is like the juxtapositions between our skill sets and our interests,
Yes.
things that make us really unique. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add because I write poetry as well. I don't write it as often as I used to, but I would add that, you know, there's also a rhythmic crossover because when I'm writing prose, I do a lot of speech writing. And, you know, with speech writing, you have to lean into the cadence of the speaker. I don't ever script myself, which is interesting, but I script others as part of my work.
Hmm.
And I have to know the cadence of those individuals. And that really feeds into my fiction writing as well, because I kind of joke sometimes that whoever I'm writing for is a fiction character. Like that's how I get it done, right? I have to get myself out of the way and write from that person's voice and write with that person's cadence in mind because a certain rhythm has to go, you know, to the piece. But even when I'm writing my fiction, sometimes I know a sentence isn't done because the rhythm is not there, right? And that's something that gets carried over from poetry. So there is a lot of bleed over from one genre to another.
Absolutely. And I think the lyricism of the language and the sort of almost like, let's call it a musicality, is perfect for a story that begins in New Orleans. Um, can you talk a little bit about our protagonist, Eric, and how you shaped his voice and maybe like what role the city played in shaping that voice?
Yeah, you know, what's really interesting, Jen, is Eric was not originally the protagonist,
Mm.
and he wasn't the narrator. The original narrator was Ruth, his grandmother. The original storyline was her story as an individual who um, was living with PTSD from some of her young adult experiences. And I was trying to write her story. But part of her PTSD is that she does not want to tell that story. She has buried it, she has refused to share it. And because she has refused to share it, it causes all sorts of problems for Eric, right? Because then, you know, she's misunderstood, which bleeds over into him being misunderstood and alienated and ostracized by peers. So I was trying to write her story. And what happened was, as a character, Ruth kept shutting down. And people will sometimes say, well, but you're the author. Can't you just make her say whatever you want her to say? Well, I could, but that would be author intrusion, right? That would be me inserting my voice and inserting, you know, what I want the reader to know in, you know, in the story. But as a character, Ruth's profile was such that Ruth did not want to tell the story. And so I could get her to go so far, and then she would shut down on me, and I'd have to think, like, how am I going to get her? Like, what's the thing that's going to get her, to talk, right? So there's so much content. There's a sandbox analogy. I got this idea from Stephanie Story, another writer, and she talks about how as writers we have to build a sandbox first. And the sandbox is like you're collecting all of these grains of sand, basically. That's everything you know about your characters, everything you know about the setting, everything you know about their relationships with one another, their backstories, their trauma. Like you have all of that stuff in the sandbox. And then you're building the story or building the castle on that sandbox. If you don't build a sandbox, you can't build a castle because it won't have a foundation to stand on, right? So I knew all of this stuff about Ruth, a lot more than comes out in the stories in the novels. So I'm always thinking maybe I'll do short stories about, Ruth next. But knowing her, to be true to her, I had to also be true to the fact that she didn't want to speak. And so I started writing it in two different points of view at one point. So I would alternate between Ruth and Eric. And basically, what happened was Ruth got more and more quiet, Eric got louder and louder. And eventually, he took over the story, and I had to surrender that Eric's the one telling the story. I think I was about 80 pages in at that point, and it was alternating back and forth between both perspectives in past tense. And at that point, I realized, okay, I need to go back to ground zero and write this over from his perspective.
That's absolutely fascinating to hear. And I wonder if that, that sort of that deep writing history, all the writing that doesn't make it onto the page makes their relationship feel very lived in. And it gives her that sort of I'm not going to phrase this very eloquently, but the iceberg analogy of that there is this story underneath the surface. Yeah, like it's oh gosh, so beautiful. So speaking a little bit more of Eric, I would love to know about the challenges and perhaps the advantages of writing Hurricane Katrina from a young person's perspective. Was it harder to capture from a young person's perspective? Did that give you unique perspectives that you could use? What was that like?
So here's the thing about that. Two things. One is initially Hurricane Katrina was nowhere in the novel, believe it or not. And I sat down at one point and I started as part of building my sandbox, that's so much of the process, but it was also like you continue to build a process. You're getting to know the characters and their situations as you're writing, at least for me, that's how it works. And so at one point I created a spreadsheet and I started mapping out my characters' lives. And I was actually covering much more time. It was like from 1960 to 2010. And so I had these periods of like 10-year, time periods, and I would write down like what the characters went through or what they witnessed, during this time period. And Hurricane Katrina was um, the one thing that showed up in everyone's timeline. It showed up in everyone's experience. And so at that point, I had the issue of what do I do with that? What do I do with that? Do I make this just a mention? Because originally the story was set in 2009. So I had to decide whether or not I was going to just have it like, oh, they all somehow mentioned Hurricane Katrina. As a survivor of Hurricane Katrina, I was born and raised in New Orleans. Okay. So Hurricane Katrina changed my life completely. And I was immediately aware that Hurricane Katrina changes everything. It changes everything I've mapped out about these characters. It changes everything I thought I knew about them because I had not yet factored in that they lived through Hurricane Katrina. And so when I did, I I had to start working with that information. And once I started working with that information, Hurricane Katrina began to take over, and it ultimately became the way the story is framed. The story is literally framed from the Saturday before the floodwaters rose to the August after. So August 2005 to August 2006. Regarding the difficulty of writing it from Eric's perspective, that was not especially difficult because I've been a teacher for many years and I taught kids his age. I also had those students share their stories with me when I reconnected with them after Hurricane Katrina, as well as family members. And those of us who have survived Katrina, we talk about Katrina, it comes up in conversation. I've worked with students, even when I started working with students here in Houston, I worked with a super senior one time, like, in his fifth year of high school trying to get through. And there was something really familiar about him from the beginning. And it ended up being that he was from New Orleans. He had lived through Katrina. That was a big part of, his challenges with getting through school and dealing with the reality of his PTSD. One of my nephews was, now he was younger than Eric at the time, but he was, he and his mom didn't leave the city before the floodwaters rose. So he went through the experience of having to, go through that water and um, seeing seeing the dead bodies and seeing the dead animals. And I will never forget when we first connected with him after the storm, and we evacuated with it was my husband, two toddlers, an infant, and my mom. We all evacuated together and with our dog. It was a German Shepherd. So it was a rough trip, very long trip. And the dog was in the backyard at my grandmother's house sleeping. And when he saw the dog sleeping, he had a panic attack because he thought the dog was dead because he had, witnessed so much death. And he was still very close to it at that point. Um, so I had lived my version of Katrina, but I had also had so many conversations with people who lived their versions of Katrina and so much experience working with kids his age and especially with boys. So I often have people ask, like, was it hard for me to write, to create a male character? And no, because I have all brothers and I have three sons and one daughter. I have um, eight nephews, and one niece, so it's that kind of thing, right? I spent a lot of time with guys, and so it was easy to create the male characters. Not that they're really like any one particular guy who I know, but I'm familiar. When I my last teaching position in New Orleans was at New Orleans Charter Middle School, and we had four teachers per grade level. It was a pretty small school, but in each of those little cohorts, it was like three female teachers and one male teacher. So whenever we would divide the boys and girls, I would always take a group of boys because we needed two teachers to take a group of boys and two to take the girls. And I would always opt to take the boys. So one of the things that I learned by doing that, I learned that guys are actually incredibly vulnerable together with no girls around. And so I had all of that experience to kind of draw from in creating Eric and Neil and all of the guys that show up, once they, cross over into Houston on the recovery side, just from my experiences working with kids and living as a little sister, as an auntie, as a teacher, all of that.
In the book, Eric finds a door, and this is where I'm going to start to make my questions really broad so that you can reveal what you're comfortable being revealed. And there are some magical realist elements that pop up at this point in the story. I'd love if we could talk a little bit about sort of how you use these elements, the places where you sort of get to stretch reality a little bit. How does
Mhm.
that speak to how you depict trauma and PTSD? Because I feel like it's one of the modes through which you express like there's so many types of fragmentation, so many types of dislocation happening in this story. Can you talk about all that a little bit?
Yes, I wanted to release Ruth's story without it being stagnant. I wanted to breathe life into the story that she wouldn't tell in a way that allowed Eric a firsthand experience. Like I wanted him to experience it when she wouldn't talk, right? Um, that's something that you can't quite get through just the imagery, you know? You can get some of it through stories when those stories are shared. My experience has been that like Ruth was really based on my experience with other seniors that just refused to tell their stories, including my own great grandmother. Um, my great grandmother, when she passed at 108 in 2020, I did not know that she was involved at all in the civil rights movement until after she turned 100. And stories started coming out at that point. When she passed, there was headline after headline about Beatrice Lehman Greene's civil rights legend dies at 108. But when I would go to my grandmother and ask her to share from her experiences, she would change the subject. She wouldn't talk about it. And by all, anyone who knew her would see her as very high functioning, very intelligent. Even at 108 years old, you could call her, and if she knew you, she knew when she heard your voice who you were. She remembered birthdays. I mean, she really functioned at a very high level, but she was very avoidant of conversations about that part of her history. And I was fortunate enough to get it from others who were about 20 years younger than her, who wanted to share her story and honor her at once she turned 100 years old, which is probably when she maybe gave them permission, to do so. So that idea of like Ruth not talking, that wasn't changing at all. And at one point, it was just sort of him discovering things, discovering letters, discovering photographs, and trying to piece together, a story. And then one day, I started mapping out his room. So I would say to all writers, this is the teacher in me, coming out to any young writers, it's really important that we find our people who are the first readers who are going to really be critical. Any of us who are good writers, sometimes what happens is if we don't have the right people, they will just tell us, "Oh, it's great, it's good, it's so good," and we kind of know that something's not working, but they won't tell us because they don't have the skills yet to tell us, right? But I was with a cohort of individuals who were all working on their MFA degrees and all studying craft and studying writing, and we would do workshops with one another. And the thing that kept coming up was people were getting lost in the house. They were trapped in a house post Katrina, and they're trying to I have to move these characters around, and I wasn't moving them around in a way that made sense. So people kept, asking questions, and I was really stubborn about it because I thought I understood how the house was made, and I decided to create a map solely for the purpose of proving them wrong. Like I'm being really honest. Okay, I'm going to show them this map and they're going to then understand. Now, obviously, that doesn't really work on the other side of writing because unless I'm going to have the map on the page, the reader's going to be as confused as they were. But when I created the map, I realized that they were right and I was wrong. That was number one. But also, there was this extra space behind Eric's closet. And when I saw that extra space in my map that I'd created, I was like, oh, that's it. And it just opened up this world of opportunity for solving the problem that I had been having of bringing Ruth's story to the surface. And I was very concerned about Eric as a character. I'm very concerned in general about the tendency that we have to not pass our stories on to the next generation. I think it does them a disservice. I think it is a gift for us to share, right? Even when it's tough, even when it hurts, because in that story, we are also sharing with that next generation resiliency, reconciliation, right? Restoration, all of those things, so that when they go through a difficult time, they have something they can refer back to. Like, okay, well, if you lived through that and survived, then I can live through this. And Eric didn't have that. So I was very concerned that he needed it. I really like he was not going to be okay, without it. That was how I ended up adding the magic realism, honestly, like just determining there was that extra space and there was this need I had to bring her story to life, and that allowed something to be on the other side of that door.
I love that because it solved your writing problem. That is such a vivid and charged image from children's literature, from myth, like a door that takes you to another realm that shows you something about the world and yourself. So it's such a modern story, but there's also a real timelessness to it, and it's
Yes.
really, really lovely.
Thank you.
What is on the horizon for you? Are you working on anything right now?
I am I am working on more than one thing right now.
Mhm.
And I am trying to push myself to commit to one with greater focus. Like, so I'm not sure yet which one, is the next complete project. Um, I am working on a short story collection. I always use a working title just because it helps me, since I do tend to work on more than one thing at a time. It helps me to compartmentalize the work in my head. So when I think of things, I can attach it to a title. So I don't know if the title will stick, but my working title is actually The Legend of Crazy Ruth and Other Stories. So it is a short story collection because I have all of that. I have so much content that I pulled out because I changed the perspective. And there are things that had kind of come to the surface when I was writing it in third person that I really want to, do some more work with. I feel like I'm not done with her as a character. Um, but I'm also working on a bit of a ghost story. It's like a kid goes on a field trip, and I won't say where the kid goes, but where they go, there is a ghost that latches onto them and goes home with them. So I'm playing around with that story, and I am also working on a piece that's centered around death row.
Mm.
And right now, the death row piece actually has my greatest attention, but I'm not sure it's going to be the next one that I complete. I'm not a fast writer, so I make no claims that a year from now we'll have the next title. I'm very much a perfectionist, and I really need to sit with the characters a long time and get to know them so well that they begin to show up with me during the workday. Like if I'm sitting in a meeting and someone says something and I say something crazy, like, that's what Ruth would say, then I know that I have crossed over into the territory of knowing that character well enough that I can sink my heels in and just focus, on that story. So I'm still working on getting to know the characters involved in these pieces more because even with the Legend of Crazy Ruth, um, I'm getting to know more of the characters from her time in college and from her young adult years. So there's still a lot of character exploration going on.
I'm so glad to hear that because I could read so much more about Ruth. I really am so fascinated with her as a character, and it was such a pleasure to talk to you about this story and to learn more about it. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate you and the opportunity to have this conversation today.
You're very welcome. All right, listeners, please check out Behind the Waterline. As we've been saying, it is absolutely beautiful. I think it's going to be a very, very emotional and ultimately uplifting read if you choose to read it. So please do. It is available by the time that you hear this. Check out your favorite independent bookstore or library website, wherever you like to go for books. Do you have a favorite bookstore that you like to send people to?
I like to send people to their local bookstores and to say, just choose a bookstore in a neighborhood. Choose a bookstore in your community. If it is not already on the shelf, it is available to be ordered, through that bookstore. And you might find it on the shelf. I get little surprises from people all the time who say, "Hey, look, it's over here." So definitely go after your local bookstore. And the paperback is going to be released soon. Before the end of this year, we will have the paperback available as well. So you'll have more options out there. The ebook, the paperback, and the hardback will all be available before the end of this year. So check out the local bookstores.
I love that advice. Thank you so much. All right. So this has been Jen in conversation with Kionna Walker LeMalle about Behind the Waterline. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.